Okay, I think we're going to make a start. Thank you for coming to our session. I think it's a testimony to the progress that the games industry is making that this session is called Player Engagement, the Good, the Bad, and the Great, because probably not that long ago, a few years ago, we could have still called it the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I think that, the context for this talk is to talk a little bit about the progress that the industry has made in terms of making sustainable games, making great player experiences, and making profit and good revenues out of that. For you guys that don't know us, my name's Mark Robinson. This is Isaac Roseboom. We're from deltaDNA. We're newly part of the Unity family. I think we're on day 4. It's great to be part of the gang. We need to get some T-shirts.
In the post.
But we live and breathe player engagement. If you don't know us, deltaDNA is founded 8 years ago in Edinburgh. We're analytics guys at heart. We've got an inbuilt curiosity about player experience, about using data to understand how we can improve games. And throughout that journey, we've really started to see the industry make giant strides in understanding player experiences and taking action on them. That's why, although we started as an analytics company, we really see analytics being actionable now. And that's all about building engagement, building great experiences, and driving revenues and profitability in our industry. So that journey is something that we've tracked, and it's been phenomenal how the games industry has taken that leap. I think a lot faster than perhaps other sectors. And the reason for that is the economic necessity. As we all know, it's tough building games. You worry about retention rates, then you worry about player experience, then you worry about revenues, then you worry about UA. You're always worrying about this stuff. But now we've got to a good situation, and I think that we've started to unlock the ingredients that are in the recipe. And we're partway through the journey. So what we do at deltaDNA is every 12 months we take a look back and we see what we've learned in the last 12 months. We live at the sharp end like you guys in terms of developers and publishers. What can we do to be more intimate with our players, to understand their experience, to make the games more responsive to their wishes and their demands? And so every time we find out something interesting and new, we like to share that with the community because a rising tide floats all boats. And our mission is to make data and analytics accessible in terms of insights and to make the industry as a whole more successful, whether you're the biggest publisher or the smallest studio. And we want to share those insights with the industry. So what we did at the start of this year was we actually looked at the progress. Where is the growth coming from? Because we know from the headlines that the industry is growing really strongly, I think 19% year on year. And what we did was we charted from deltaDNA data the revenues that were accumulated annually by App Store position. And what you can see from this chart is that in the short time from 2016 to 2018, the revenues have grown dramatically. At position 100 in the charts, you've gone from $2.5 million income, from $5.5 million income. Position 1,000 in the charts, you've gone from $250,000 to nearly 8 to 10 times that amount. So this is great news for the industry and developers as a whole. You don't have to be at the top of the charts now to make money. You can sustain really good revenues from around 1 million MAU. You can start to build a portfolio of games, and you can start to think of LTVs as a multi-game relationship with your players. And I think that's the next drive for the industry. We're moving from a game-by-game approach to thinking of the player relationship as a multi-game relationship. So this progress is really, really impressive, and it's over a short period of time. That means that publishers and developers are using tools like deltaDNA to understand lifetime value and making solid bets on their UA and making much more effective and efficient decisions about their UA budgets. So that's the kind of headline, and then we started to delve in a little bit as to unpacking that information. What is the difference here? And we introduced the deltaDNA index. Our clients collect a lot of rich data inside the game to balance the game and understand the player experience. And we think about retention, and we think about experience, and we think about in-app purchase strategies, and we think about ad strategies, and all of these things come together. And so what we've seen in combining these metrics into a deltaDNA index is a great way of tracking not just the progress that the industry is making in terms of pure revenue, but how the metrics are driving that success. What are the things that are top of mind, common topics in publishers and developers these days? And where are the improvements coming from in terms of the game economy? And what you can see from this chart, again, it's 2016 to 2018, is that if you sort of benchmark at 100, 2016, we've seen reasonable progress in 2017, and then a surge of improvement in terms of the indexes in 2018. And that's really notable. We will continue to run the deltaDNA index into the future now, and then we can get a temperature check of what is happening in the industry, what's happening inside your games, and how we can perpetuate this success. So what we looked at, just to unpack that a little bit more, is individual metrics that combine into the deltaDNA index. And where we see the movement here is not so much in retention. Retention is holding steady. It's improving a little bit. But that's great because, retention is already pretty good in the industry, having focused on engagement and retention in the first part of our history. But what we can see now is that conversion rates are improving. So in-app purchase strategies are starting to fire on all cylinders. The RPMI is increasing steadily. So as well as the retention rates and the engagement rates holding up, what we're seeing is much more effective in-app purchase strategies, and also ad strategies are now contributing significantly to the game economies in a way that they haven't done before. And a lot of the focus that we've had in deltaDNA supporting our clients is blending in-app purchase and ad strategies so that individual players get the right balance in terms of how they want to play their games. So as I say, we're making fantastic progress as an industry. We will continue to do these good works. We're partway through this journey. I think that the future for deltaDNA is really exciting inside Unity by automating a lot more of this intelligence and making the ability to do quite sophisticated player management within gaming environments second to none. And we'll continue to share these insights and these nuggets with the industry. So now I'll hand over to my colleague Isaac, and he's going to talk a lot about the building blocks of engagement and some really important and interesting findings that we've seen over the last 12 months.
Thanks, Mark. So in my usual fashion, I'm actually going to disagree with Mark instantly and go back to retention. And I think this is not so much a disagreement as a kind of natural progression that Mark was showing that. And I think this is true in the history of free-to-play games. There was a lot of focus on basic retention mechanics, basic engagement mechanics in the early days. And then, the next wave of improvements has come on the monetization side, where games have been able to improve their economies by introducing things like rewarded ads and having a much more stable in-app purchase economy. And now I think actually we're starting to see people going back to engagement to try to optimize that a bit more. And hopefully this talk will show you where there's some gaps there that potentially, the best practices or the kind of measurements that we're using to optimize engagement are not quite there. But just to begin, I think everyone can agree that modern free-to-play games, or the best free-to-play games, are really, really built to last, right? And I think, I did this analysis a while back, but it's almost certainly still true that, of the top 10 games in the store, 8 are older than a year. And of the top 100, 86 are older than a year. So, what's happening is that the best games, the people at the top of the charts, are the ones that have built a game that can sustain for a long time, right? And to be fair, this is not a new thing, right? So the game, I'm sure many of you know Bejeweled. Bejeweled has been around for probably almost 20 years now in one form or another. So the idea of building a long-lasting game that engages with people for a long period of time is not a new idea. Now, why is having a long-lasting game important? Whoop, wrong one. It's all broken.
Oops.
Sorry, guys. Try it. No, next one. Okay, we're back on schedule. Yeah, so why is having a long game so important? So what I did just to kind of prove this point was I looked at data in the deltaDNA platform, and I tried to build up, if you have a certain amount of ARPDAU, where does that ARPDAU come from? So if we take a long-lived game like one that's over a year old, what's interesting is that 70% of the revenue is going to come from players that are over a month old, right? So if you're out there and you've just launched your game and you're scratching your head going like, why can't I get 30-cent ARPDAUs? Why can't I compete with the people on the top of the charts? It's because almost all of their revenue is coming from old players that they've engaged over a long period of time. And so I always think about when you're trying to build up your monetization, you're building up these layers of sediment of players. You've got very old players, you're very highly engaged players that are contributing quite a lot of revenue. You've got your sort of newly engaged players that are just sort of getting to grips with the game, and then you've got your new players who are obviously excited as well. If you don't have that kind of those layers of sediment of players at different ages, if you're churning players really quickly, you're never going to be able to build up a large ARPDAU, and that naturally has consequences for how you can reinvest in UA and how you can reinvest in developing your game and live ops and these kind of things. So, and I mean, one thing I was going to say here is that the best games, to do this, you have to optimize for player lifetime. So what is player lifetime? So some people in the audience might be familiar with this kind of curve. So basically, when I talk about player lifetime, and this is important for the rest of this talk, but I think also this is an important concept in the industry at large. If you think about how many days a player has been in the game, right? From the day that, so day 0 is the day you install, day 30 retention, and so on. The player lifetime is how many days do you actually expect that player to play in the game on average. Now, of course, some people churn on the first day, some people churn in the first week. But if you think about for an install, what's the average number of days that people in that install cohort will actually play, right? And this is just the sum of the retention curve, right? So this curve here, as it grows, is just the sum of your retention. So basically what you're getting to is how many days do I expect a player to actually appear in my game? And this is really important because if you want to measure LTV, then the LTV is just the ARPDAU times this thing. So if you can improve this thing, right, then you're instantly improving your LTV. And most games have a lifetime between 5 to 50 days. Now, obviously, you can see there's a big dynamic range in that number, which is obviously the difference between the best games and games that might struggle. What I thought was interesting is if you start to compare this player lifetime with the numbers that we tend to use to optimize game performance, right? So what I did is I took about 10,000 different player cohorts from deltaDNA, for all these games that have been in the platform for at least a year, so we can actually see what the player lifetime was after a year. And I tried to correlate day 1 retention with the lifetime. And what's very interesting is that there's almost no correlation between day 1 retention and the lifetime of people in the game. So essentially what this is saying is that, I mean, fair enough, you can't have extremely low day 1, so you don't see any cohorts below kind of 35 that have very high lifetimes. But once you get to day 1 retention of about 35%, it has no impact on the actual lifetime of the player. Now, this might seem a bit crazy, right? Because you're thinking like, if I can't get people to come back on day 1, how the hell am I going to come back on day 365? But I think there's, and I'll get to the kind of underpinnings in this in a sec, but I think there's a certain amount of thought here that what you're doing on day 0 and day 1, you have to start thinking a lot longer term. Things that you can optimize to get people back on the first day and not necessarily things that's going to be good for them in the long term. Just moving through the other retention metrics, so we go to day 7. There's a little bit tighter correlation. You can see that they're kind of going up to the top right there. But there's still a factor of 3 in terms of lifetime at day 7 equals 20%, right? So many of us would think 20% day 7 retention, that's awesome. I'm really happy that I've hit my target KPI, but still there's some cohorts here that only have a lifetime of 10 days, and some of them have lifetimes of 30 days plus. There's some genre-specific stuff here, as you can see in the colors, but there's still quite a big gap there. So just optimizing for day 7 retention is not going to give you the biggest LTV necessarily. And again, by the time you get to day 30, we were a lot more tightly correlated, and clearly that makes sense. Day 30 is a long time into a player's life cycle, but still, there's still quite a lot of spread here, very much genre-specific at this point. And so I think the message I'm trying to get across here is that just looking at these sort of basic and easily obtainable retention metrics is not enough to optimize your LTV or your lifetime. Just for some fun facts, and I think you could see there that the genre spread was quite wide. There is a really, really strong trend across the different genres for different lifespans. So casino and puzzle games typically have like really quite long lifespans. So the median for casino and puzzle games is like 15, 20 days plus. And then action and simulation games actually have the shortest lifespan. And so what's interesting, if you think about this, is actually a casino game with half the ARPDAU of a sports game will have the same LTV. And so that's where you have to think about how do you optimize your different metrics, because if you're optimizing for just ARPDAU and day 7 retention, you're not necessarily getting the LTV equation. So what I wanted to do, because I thought it would be fun, is to try to segment out these curves so we can have broad classes, right? And I think you can already see what I was hinting at before, that there's clearly a category of games which have good, what we call good retention metrics, like day 7, day 30, but not necessarily the longest lifespan. And so what I tried to do is segment those out so you can start to see how the different lifetime curves look for what I've called bad, good, and great games. So bad games are, and it's a bit unfair to call them bad games, but bad games are ones that sort of take off quite quickly in terms of the player engagement and then just plateau, right? So this is the kind of pinkish line that you can see there. So they're not really adding very much activity after about the first week. Now, about 60% of the games we have on our platform fit into that category, which sort of runs along the same line as the statistic I always like to say, which is about 60% of the games that we have on platform are not ROAS positive, so they're not actually able to get back their UA spend. The more interesting curves are the good and the great. So these are kind of about roughly 20% each in terms of the population of games. And what you can see is there's a really big difference between the good games, which again sort of take off quite well, much better than the bad games. Engagement's really good early on, but start to plateau. And these games are kind of plateauing out at about 13, 14 days total player lifetime. The great games, however, they sort of take off in the same way, but they just continue going up, right? They continue this high level of player engagement, and then they're topping out at 20 days plus. Right, and you can already see in these curves that the good and the great games look really similar when you start looking at things like day 7, day 30 retention. But the great games are the ones that engage players much longer term, and so have a much higher opportunity to monetize them later on in their lifespan. And just to float some numbers in terms of the actual KPIs, right? The day 1 retention for these different cohorts is not actually that much different. Obviously, these are averages, so they're kind of pulled up by the better games. But in terms of the bad, good, and great games, they kind of have the same day 1. Day 7, you start to see the bad games falling away. But again, day 7 retention for the good curve is 22%. Day 7 for the great curve is 24%. Even day 30, it's not that much different. But when you get to day 365, it's like a factor of 3 different, right? And that means that you have this huge difference in the actual lifespan. And so when you think about how that impacts LTV, you're talking about a factor of 2 or 3 between the great games and the good games in terms of LTV. And as many of the people in the room can imagine, when you start to then put LTV into ROAS, that if you're giving up a factor of 2 in your LTV, that's really going to impact your ability to grow the game, because the CPIs you can afford are much lower. So just to dig into this a little bit more deeply, what are these great games doing differently, right? So obviously we have access to quite a lot of rich data at deltaDNA, but just kind of sticking to the simple numbers that you can measure across all games. The first thing I looked at was sessions, right? So hit simple kind of stat, what's the sessions per day for these different types of games? And what's really interesting is that the great games start at quite a high session count per day, and of course the engagement goes down a little bit, so you're starting off at sort of 3.5+ sessions a day on day 0 in the first week. And then it's sort of coming down to sort of between 2.5 to 3 sessions per day. But what's really interesting is that when you look at the bad and the good games, they're really dropping off really, really quickly, right? So they're not able to get people, they're generating a lot of initial energy in the players, but they're not able to sustain that. So players are sort of playing a lot less sessions per day as they get deeper into their lifespan. So that's interesting. But of course, sessions is only one part of the equation. So how long are these sessions? Your laptop doesn't like me, Mark. And what's really interesting is that when you look at the session length, the bad and the good games have really long session lengths early on. And so my kind of read on this is that basically what these games are doing is that they're offering too much content and they're burning players out early on. They're giving away a lot of the game in the first week, which makes sense because you're optimizing for day 7 retention, you're optimizing day 1 retention. Of course you want to get people in, you want them to play long sessions. But the long-term impact of that is that either there's not enough content and the pacing is wrong, so players, they run out of momentum or they run out of game to play, or they just burn out. They've got the experience they want and they don't need to play the game anymore. And so what's really interesting is that the great games have more sessions per day, but lower session lengths. Even early on, they have very, very strictly limited first sessions. And what you're doing here is you're creating in the players a sustainable pattern of play, right? And that's important because, it's not necessarily important in the first week, but when you start to get to day 180, day 365, that sustainability of play, that having a game that people can interact with, which is not going to overwhelm them, becomes really, really, really important. And of course, different genres have different session lengths. So this is the sort of table of first session length. I'm not going to go through them all. So you can see that, so for instance, like action games and sort of simulation games have shortish first sessions. Puzzle, well, actually, they're all kind of around 7 to 10 minutes if you start looking at the great games. When you look at the bad and the good games, they kind of tend to be a bit longer. But aiming for this magical number of sort of 10 to 12 minutes seems to be about right across most genres. But obviously, there's a little bit of genre-specific stuff there. And so this is where you start to get into the free-to-play game design, right? So this is just a toy example of how you might design your game. And clearly, what we've seen a lot when we worked with different games is that games that are really struggling for long-term retention tend to have really bad pacing problems. So, players might be able to consume 50% plus of the content in the first week. Clearly, that's going to have an impact on how engaged they stay. Particularly, if I'm a player and I love a game, if I know that I can complete that game in 7 days, I've got a plan, right? I've already got in my mind that I'm going to finish this game at the end of the week. I'm going to put it down, and that has a lot of that impacts things like monetization and long-term retention, obviously. So the great games are paced in such a way that there's always going to be more content for the players to consume, and they can see that. They can invest in the game long term because they know there's always going to be something for them to do. This is a kind of a parallel concept, but I wanted to talk through it because, again, it's about optimizing for the wrong metrics. And so, it's obvious that if people are optimizing for day 1 retention or they're optimizing for ARPDAU in the first week and things like this, right? You're going to be very aggressive in the first session. You're going to want people to play a long time because if they play a long time, they have more opportunity to spend, right? There's a classic thing I always say, which is that people can't spend if they're not playing, right? So if you want day 0 ARPDAUs to go up, you need them to play a long time. But the problem with that is that even though your short term, your revenues go up, actually most likely what you're doing is pulling a lot of future revenue onto day 1, day 2. And long-term, that may not be, if you think about the whole life cycle of the player, that might not be the best thing. Because essentially, even though you think your numbers are going up, actually, if you had let the players sort of progress on their own, they would have converted anyway, and then they'd have a better long-term monetization pattern. Because what ends up happening when you pull revenue or engagement forward is you create a hangover. because you're creating a pace of either spending or playing that's not sustainable. And so then obviously there'll be a dip, and then that dip is something which can easily cause churn. So how do you do this in terms of mechanics, right? Well, the classic way people do it is timers. I mean, this is why games have timers, right? There's loads of different timers. You can have energy-based timers, which is the one on the top left, the Looney Tunes. You can have lives. I mean, lives with timers is essentially the same kind of concept as energy. So we've got one from Homescapes. Obviously, the build and battle games have build timers, or other kind of simulation games have build timers, which work to limit the session length. And then obviously things like Clash Royale have what we call like soft limits with reward timers, so you can still play the game, but you don't get as many rewards if you keep playing. And so all of these are essentially how games have been working to try to. I mean, people think about these timer mechanics as being monetization mechanics, but actually, when they're used effectively, they're used to basically get the right session lengths, right? That's when they're most effective, is when you're actually controlling the pace of play. The nice thing, of course, they are monetization mechanics because people will want to spend to play more, so you're setting up a nice pay-to-play pattern, which is one of the best ways to use IAP monetization. But effectively, what you're doing is setting up a nice pattern of sustainable play that people can extend occasionally with IAPs, but not necessarily all the time. So again, more deeper examples. One of the things I really like in recent years is this kind of proliferation of these task lists. So this is Marvel Strike Force, which does as well, but obviously one of the early and really good examples of this was Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes. So here, what you're doing is you're creating a really nice sessionization pattern by giving people a list of things to do every day that you know will take them a certain amount of time and will give them a certain amount of rewards. And so you're creating this nice pattern of play where on any day, people will go and do this. Some days they might do more, but they'll always do this amount because they know that they'll get the rewards that they need to sustain their play. And so it gives you lots of levers to balance your game, because you can, by putting more or less things in this list, you can increase the session length or decrease it. You can have natural inflation of difficulty or inflation of the economy, because you can reward people differently as they progress and as they unlock different content. So this gives you a lot of control over how you sessionize your game and control the economy. Another one which is interesting is AR game, actually, The Walking Dead, is you can control the amount of content people can access by what's in their immediate vicinity, right? So here, obviously, it's an AR game, as you can only interact with things in a certain distance from where you are. And so that naturally means that there's only a certain amount of content you can do in a certain session. What's really neat about this game, of course, is it does that same pay-to-play concept, but the way you operate that is, of course, you pay to expand your area, or you pay to move into someone else's area. And so that gives you a really nice balance of, okay, I've established a nice pattern of play. I can work in my immediate vicinity on a standard day, but occasionally when I want to play a bit more, I can actually expand that by paying, or I can jump into one of my friends' areas. So again, the core concept here is that what you're trying to do is get very nice pacing and get content delivery in a sustainable way. But what you're trying to do that in an organic way that feels natural to the player. You're not sort of forcing them out aggressively. You're building a game that they can engage with. Or here, this is a natural mechanic. It's obvious. It makes sense to me in the context of the game and the story of the game that I can only interact with things in a certain area. There's nothing unnatural about it. But what, of course, the implication of that is that you've got really fine-grained control over the game progression. And there's loads of other things you can do out there. These are just a few ideas that we kind of had in the office, just sort of spitballing. So, there's lots of soft reward blockers out there. Clash Royale was one of the first to do this. Lots of people have copied that. You can do, rather than, that model is much more about, you have more rewards, or you have rewards at the beginning of a session and then taper off, right? So you can imagine things like having a 15-minute experience or progression or reward multiplier on the first session. You can have like multipliers on the rewards early on. You can have them in sort of hourly blocks. But this idea of, there's a base game and you give more for a certain period of time, and then what that means is that people will naturally start to drift off at the end of that time is the core concept here. So you're getting people to that And it'll be different for different games, but the magic range seems to be sort of 8 to 12-minute sessions that people can happily play 3-4 times a day without it becoming too onerous to them. So hopefully that was kind of a nice summary of why I think that games need to focus a lot more on that long-term retention and how you can do that by creating sustainable play. And to be honest with you, I could have gone into a lot more sort of technical descriptions of how you do that with analytics and things like that, but I think a lot of you can sort of imagine how that works for your games and how you might want to optimize for that. The challenge, of course, is that when you're trying to build a game, you don't have a year of data to optimize on, so you have to start to look to best practices and what other games are doing. But I think, for me, there's a lot of good games out there, really, really good games that are really well run and have really good analytics and really good live ops and really good game design. But because they're being optimized for short-term retention metrics, they're not reaching their potential. And so I think, being able to go back and start to look at these early numbers to say, like, well, maybe actually I wanted to optimize for ROAS in the first week, but actually what that's doing is hurting my long-term retention. Maybe I need to dial that back a little bit so that you can get players in a sustainable pattern of play, and you can start to drop in more content and more live ops as they progress through their lifespan and build up that kind of structure I was talking about at the beginning, which is this sediment of players that are paying every day at different ages, right? And if you can do that, that's how you can build a game that lasts for years, not months. But of course, design is really crucial here, and that's why I talked a lot about design at the end, because analytics and all this stuff is great, but you need to have a design that doesn't feel aggressive to the players, right? That feels natural and fits within the concept of the game. And I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
So I think we've got a couple of minutes if anybody's got any questions. The back. Can you shout? Here it comes.
I'm curious as to your perspective on the future a little bit, since you're looking at a lot of data. Do you see a drop-off on in-app purchases and ad revenue as a result of platforms like Apple Arcade, and do you think that that would be very disruptive for this industry?
No. I think, subscription models have been around for a long time. Different types of games naturally suit different types of business models, right? For instance, there's certain games out there that would never have ads, rewarded ads, monetization, because it doesn't make sense given their high opt-outs. So I think it's very much horses for courses. There's types of games that you can put in things like Apple Arcade that you would never launch as pure free-to-play, or if you did, you'd have to change in a way that doesn't suit the way they're meant to be played. So I think there's space for everything. And I mean, it makes sense to me that you think about when the App Store launched, it was mostly premium games. It's those style of games that we'll see coming back, like sort of shorter experiences, very high quality, but designed to be relatively bite-sized, that you'll see coming into things like Apple Arcade. So I think there's room for all types.
One thing that we've found out is you can't switch games between premium and free-to-play. You got to start with a particular mindset to make each of those work and the concepts work. So I think there's genuinely parallel streams here, and we're looking to attract different types of players.
Hi. So I was watching this from a hyper-casual perspective because I'm a co-founder of a hyper-casual studio, and I was just wondering, because the way hyper-casual works is the exact opposite of what you are talking about here. Mm-hmm. So not even day 7 retention, we like almost exclusively focus on day 1 retention. And so what do you think about that sort of like hyper-casual versus casual, and where do you think that hyper-casual trend is going?
So, I mean, I don't necessarily know why hyper-casual games can't be converted into normal casual games. I mean, I guess it's whether you think that the mechanics, because this is the kind of tension here, right? You make a hyper-casual game with really easy and intuitive mechanics, but that has a natural ceiling in terms of like how many levels you can make or how long people will engage with it. I think no one's really tested whether you can push the engagement of hyper-casual games, because most people are trying to, like, you generate 200 levels, ship it, move on to the next one. Whether you can start to bundle hyper-casual games into like a larger meta, which has these type of long-term engagement, because to some extent, and I would imagine, maybe you're seeing this already, you'll have people in your ecosystem that are jumping from game to game to game. Why not help facilitate that with a larger meta that covers all of them? So I think things like that will be the future of that genre, because the reality is there's a lot of inefficiency if you bring, you're paying CPIs to get people into hyper-casual games. Fair enough, not the same as the core games, but and then there's like a leaky pipe, and you're hoping that some of them come to your next title. So why not try to plug the leaks, essentially? And all I've talked about here is essentially plugging leaks in a single game. So.
Thank you.
So very nice presentation. So the question is, you were talking about fine-tuning based on player natural experience, right? And is there a way we can plug in machine learning to design these natural experiences and fine-tune values?
Well, yes. And so I think, it was in the keynote last night, and I think it'll be a really interesting session later today on GameTune, which is essentially doing a lot of what we're talking about here, but doing it with machine learning, right? So when I talk about let's optimize for the right session length, let's optimize for the right economy, I'm talking about doing it by hand with analytics, but things like GameTune can do that automatically for you.
So have you done it, or you are planning to incorporate? So you're saying like you're doing it with analytics and with manual effort, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that Unity has a product called GameTune which does this.
Okay. It's already there.
Yeah, so as Mark said, we're in day 4 of being part of Unity, so I don't know how it fits into our puzzle, but I'm trying to sell something for Unity here. So,
Sure. Yeah,
but it's really good. I mean, it is a really good product, and there's a reason why I was in the keynote last night. It's really exciting, and like I say, I think there's a talk later today talking about how FuturePlay use GameTune to do exactly that, and a very similar use case to what I'm talking about here.
What is definitely true is that the journey that we've been on as a company is to unlock all of this insight. There's a huge value in the data asset within the games industry, and everybody wins if we unlock that insight to generate more sophisticated player management. More sophisticated player management, right now is all about dashboard diagnostics, player segmentation, messaging strategies, and evaluating campaigns and going around that loop and iterating and learning. But absolutely, the clear next phase of this is to unlock even more insights by deploying machine learning techniques. And so we're talking very closely with the GameTune guys, because it's a natural synergy, that sort of approach with the deltaDNA approach, and it's a win-win.
Yeah, that answers. Thank you.
Any more?
Okay, thank you for listening. It's a pleasure.